On the morning of the 12th of August 2000, a huge fleet of 33 of Russia's most advanced naval warships gathered in a specific part of the Barents Sea. This sea is a massive 800-mile stretch of freezing, unforgiving water in the Arctic Circle, just northwest of Russia. These 33 ships weren't there by accident. They were there for a massive military training exercise. The plan was to run through a series of war game scenarios. For example, one ship would play the role of an enemy, and the other ships would practice locking onto it with their targeting systems and firing at it. But of course, they weren't using live ammunition. They were using dummy torpedoes and missiles, the kind that don't actually explode. Around 9 in the morning, the man in charge of this entire operation, Admiral Popov, gave the first command. He was on board one of the 33 ships overseeing everything. He authorized one of the submarines out there to shoot 2 of its dummy torpedoes at a designated target. The target was just one of the other ships pretending to be the enemy. As soon as he gave that order, the multi-day exercise officially began. All day and all through the night, these ships ran their drills, simulating combat and testing their systems. By the next morning, a full 24 hours into the exercise, Admiral Popov stepped away from the action for a bit. He had a scheduled call with some Russian reporters. During this interview, he told them that so far, the training exercise was going exactly to plan. He painted a picture of success, saying that it looked like it was going to be a huge achievement for the Russian Navy. But there was a problem. At the very same time that Admiral Popov was on the phone telling reporters how well everything was going, a rumor started to spread among the families of the crewmen who were out on the Barents Sea. The rumor was that the exercise was not going to plan at all. In fact, the word was that something terrible had happened to one of the ships. None of the family members had any concrete information. It was just a whisper, a feeling of dread that was passed from one person to another. But even though it was just a rumor, it was enough to cause serious worry. That morning, families began calling the naval base where the 33 ships had departed from, desperate for any information. At first, the phone operator at the base who was taking all these calls stuck to the official story. She told the frantic family members that no, nothing was wrong. She hadn't heard anything about any issues. But as the calls kept flooding in, the operator eventually let something slip. She admitted that she had also heard the rumor that something bad had happened, and she thought it might actually be true. One of the family members on the line heard this and immediately pressed the operator for more details. But at that point, the operator clammed up. She said she couldn't give out any more information and ended the conversation. So, the family member hung up the phone and did the next logical thing. They called the media. They told the reporters what was going on, about the rumor, and the operator's strange admission. As soon as the media had this story, they went straight back to Admiral Popov. They asked him directly if he could address the rumor, but he didn't. He gave no response to any of their questions. In a strange way, his silence was a little reassuring to some of the families. They figured that if Admiral Popov was just ignoring the rumor and staying out there on the Barents Sea, continuing with the exercise, then surely nothing truly bad could have happened. So, for the rest of that day, which was a Sunday, the families and the media just waited. There wasn't much else they could do. They had to wait for new information to come out of the exercise. The next day, on Monday, the 14th, 48 hours after the training had started, there was finally news. Russian officials went on television to formally address the rumor. And they said, yes, it was true. Something had happened during the exercise. They explained that the Kursk, which was the name of one of the submarines participating in the drill, had experienced some minor technical difficulties. They said these difficulties had forced the submarine to ground itself on the bottom of the Barents Sea. But they quickly added that everyone should remain calm. This was a normal procedure, they said. They were in radio contact with the crew, everybody was fine, and they were already pumping air and power into the submarine. They assured the public that before long, they would have the Kursk back on the surface. There was absolutely nothing to worry about. Naturally, the family members of the Kursk's crew panicked when they heard this. Even though the government officials sounded completely confident, the families did not feel confident at all. Their loved ones were trapped at the bottom of the ocean. But at the same time, they tried to hold on to a glimmer of hope. They remembered that the Kursk was not just any submarine. It was a very special and supposedly very safe vessel. The Kursk was, quite literally, Russia's best ship. No expense had been spared in its construction. It was incredibly expensive and absolutely massive, bigger than 2 football fields put together. It was built out of a specialized, highly reinforced steel that was designed to allow it to take a direct hit from a torpedo and just keep going without any major problems. The inside was also outfitted with all the latest and greatest technology. So, the thinking was, if you had to be stuck at the bottom of the ocean inside a submarine, you would want to be stuck inside the Kursk. And the families took some small comfort in that. But over the next couple of days, that comfort began to fade. Despite the government's constant reassurances in the news that everything was fine, that it was a minor issue, and that they'd have the Kursk up in no time, the submarine was still at the bottom of the sea. And the government wasn't giving the families or the media any new information. In this vacuum of information, the families began to panic again, and the media started to speculate. Did the Kursk really just suffer from minor technical difficulties like the government was saying? Or was this something much, much more serious? That question would be answered on August 21st, 9 days after the training exercise had begun. A Norwegian dive team had been brought in to assist with the recovery effort. They were able to dive down to the Kursk's location. They managed to get inside the submarine through an escape hatch. An escape hatch is like a small, watertight closet on the outside of the sub that allows people to enter and exit without flooding the interior. Once these Norwegian divers got inside the Kursk and had a look around, they were completely shocked by what they saw. While the exact details of what happened inside the Kursk are still debated to this day, and probably will be for a long time, there is one part of the story that is more or less universally accepted. And that is what happened inside of compartment number 9. The Kursk was divided into 9 separate watertight segments called compartments. Compartment 1 was at the very front of the submarine, and they were numbered sequentially all the way to compartment 9 at the very back. The reason we know what happened inside compartment 9 is because a 27-year-old crew member named Dmitry Kolesnikov told us Dmitry was born into a family of submariners. His father was a submariner, and his grandfather was a submariner. Growing up, Dmitry idolized them, and all he ever wanted to do was follow in their footsteps. In the late 1990s, his dream came true. He was commissioned as a naval officer in the Russian Navy and was given orders to serve aboard the Kursk. Just 4 months before this fateful training exercise, Dmitry met and quickly married a high school teacher named Olga. Right after their wedding, one of the first things he did was bring her on board the Kursk for a personal tour. Olga brought a video camera with her and filmed the entire tour. On that video, Dmitry is all smiles. He's so happy leading her around the ship, introducing her to his crewmates, and showing her all the cramped spaces on board. It's incredibly obvious from the video that Dmitry was so proud of his job, and even more proud to be sharing that part of his life with his new wife. Fast forward to the 12th of August 2000. Dmitry, along with 117 other crew members, had just arrived at their designated location in the Barents Sea for the exercise. At 11:27 inches the morning, the captain of the Kursk came over the radio. He spoke to Admiral Popov, who was on a separate ship. The captain informed the admiral that the Kursk was about to fire its 2 dummy torpedoes. After that call was made, the crewmen in the first compartment of the Kursk, at the very front of the sub where the torpedoes were stored, began loading the two dummies into the tubes. Meanwhile, Dmitri was all the way back in the seventh compartment. This was the engine room, and it was where he was stationed. In fact, he was the officer in charge of everyone who worked in compartment 7. So, as the two dummy torpedoes were being loaded up front, Dmitri and his men were at their posts, twisting dials and pulling levers, running through their checks. All of a sudden, there was a really loud crashing sound. Then the entire ship shuddered violently and jolted hard to one side, as if a giant hand had grabbed the front of the submarine and twisted it. What Dmitri and the men in the seventh compartment couldn't possibly have known was that one of the real live torpedoes in the first compartment had malfunctioned, and it had just exploded. But because of how well built the Kursk was, how strong its reinforced hull was, the torpedo explosion, just as advertised, did not puncture through the outer wall. It did cause a lot of damage and started a massive fire, but the sub was not yet sinking. Back in the seventh compartment, Dmitri picked himself up from the floor. Alarms were blaring, and everything was total chaos. Everyone was shouting, asking what was going on. Dmitri took charge. He ordered his men to follow their emergency protocol, which was to seal the watertight doors of their compartment. In this case, he sealed the door leading to the sixth compartment in front of them and the door leading to the eighth compartment behind them. There are a lot of reasons for this protocol, but the main one is to contain damage. If there's a leak somewhere else on the submarine, sealing off your compartment protects you from being flooded. As Dmitri and his men were turning the heavy wheels to seal the two doors, they would have started to see and smell smoke pouring in through the ventilation ducts. This smoke was coming from the uncontrolled fire that was now raging at the front of the submarine. They also would have felt the submarine suddenly pitch upward at a very steep angle. The captain of the Kursk was desperately trying to surface. But before they could reach the surface, that uncontained fire reached the other live torpedoes, and it set off an almost instantaneous chain reaction of explosions. This second collective blast was catastrophic. It killed virtually everyone in the front half of the submarine. Either the blast itself blew them apart, or they died moments later when the hull was finally breached. This second explosion was so powerful that it did puncture the walls of the sub, creating a huge hole in the front. Icy Arctic water began flooding in at an incredible rate. So if you weren't killed by the blast, you very quickly drowned. The only people who survived the first and second explosions were those in the sixth compartment and further back. So compartments 6, 7, 8, and 9. Dmitri and the other men in the seventh compartment would have been badly shaken up by that second explosion. It would have rocked the submarine and sent them tumbling all over the place. But they were still alive, and they were very aware of the terrible situation they were in. I would imagine that Dmitri and the others tried to grab onto any piping or equipment they could as the submarine, its control room now destroyed, just angled straight down and began to plummet towards the ocean floor. At 11:32 a.m., just 4 minutes after that initial explosion, the Kursk slammed nose first into the seabed 350 feet below the surface. And then the back half of the submarine settled down to rest. We don't know exactly what happened on board the Kursk for the first 2 hours after it hit the bottom. What we do know is that they had power. So there was light inside the submarine. Also, the air purifiers were still working, so despite all the chemicals and smoke in the air, it was relatively easy to breathe. We also know that at some point, Dmitri and the other men in his compartment must have heard banging coming from the sixth compartment. Remember, they had sealed off the doors to both the eighth and the sixth compartments. Hearing the banging, Dmitri made a decision. He decided to break emergency protocol. He opened the door to the sixth compartment to allow any survivors who were banging on it to come into their section. When Dmitri and his men opened that door and looked into the sixth compartment, they would have seen that it was rapidly flooding. It was also clear that most likely anybody forward of that compartment in 5, 4, 3, 2, or 1 was already dead. By 1:30 p.m., Dmitri and his men in the seventh compartment, along with the other survivors from the sixth, were forced to retreat. They moved from the seventh compartment into the eighth, and then finally into the ninth compartment at the very back of the submarine. The flooding was getting worse. Even though they had sealed off their watertight doors, the walls themselves were no longer watertight. The huge explosion had sent shrapnel flying down the body of the submarine, puncturing holes in all the walls between the compartments. So it didn't matter if you shut your watertight door. Eventually, as one compartment filled up, the water would begin leaking through all the cracks and holes in the walls. Dmitri and all the men with him would have been very aware of this. By the time they all got back to the ninth compartment, there was nowhere else to go. The water was going to eventually reach them. They were doomed, unless they were rescued or unless they could get out through the escape hatch. Despite how absolutely terrifying this situation must have been, Dmitri remained calm. In fact, he was so calm that he pulled out a piece of paper. As he's sitting there in this cramped ninth compartment with 22 other men, he writes the date and the time in the corner. Then he begins to describe what had happened. He writes about an explosion and that he thought he and these 22 other men were the only survivors. He says they are now trapped in the ninth compartment and they have to wait for rescue. He also mentions that they had considered using the escape hatch, but apparently it hadn't worked. After Dmitri wrote this very neat, very legible, and very organized note, he folded it up and put it in his pocket. Then, for the next hour and a half, he sat there inside the ninth compartment with the 22 others. And then, the power went out. This plunged them into absolute pitch-black darkness. I mean, completely black inside of there. And because the power was out, the temperatures suddenly began to plummet. Then, the worst part, the water began seeping through the walls much faster. Dmitri and the other men would have known then that it was just a matter of time before the room filled completely with water. And there was nowhere to go. So, with the water rising all around them in the dark, Dmitri pulled that piece of paper back out of his pocket, and he added to the note, but this time his handwriting is barely legible. It's because he was probably suffering from hypothermia, so he would have been shaking uncontrollably. He also couldn't see what he was writing. In fact, he writes the words, "I'm writing blind," to indicate that it's totally dark in the room. In this second part of the note, which was dated and time-stamped an hour and a half after the first one, Dmitri indicates that he does not think he's going to survive. It's very clear that none of them think they're going to make it. Then, with the remaining space on the piece of paper, Dmitri writes a very loving and thoughtful message to his wife and his family, saying goodbye. And then his final words on the note are, "Regards to everybody. No need to despair. Kolesnikov." After he wrote this second message, he folded the paper up, put it back in his breast pocket, and then, in total darkness, listening to the sound of water rushing into the room, he and the other 22 damned souls prepared to die. We don't know exactly how long Dmitri and the other 22 men survived in compartment 9. But experts say the entire Kursk submarine was completely flooded about 8 hours after the initial explosion. One of the most heartbreaking parts of this whole story is that Dmitri and those 22 other men could have potentially been saved if the Russian response had been a little more urgent and coordinated. Despite 2 of the other ships in the exercise, including the ship that Admiral Popov was on, hearing and feeling the second massive explosion from the Kursk, nothing was done about it. It was reported, but no one really took any action. And then, when no one could get in touch with the Kursk after they had said they were going to fire their dummy torpedoes, everyone just assumed it was a radio problem. They figured the Kursk was fine and would be in touch soon. So it wasn't until later that evening that the Russian Navy even figured out there was a major problem, that the Kursk had effectively vanished. And then it would be several more hours before they even got a rescue submersible into the water and down to the Kursk's location. Once it was down there, the Russian rescue sub could not latch onto the escape hatch on the submarine. So even if there were survivors inside, they would not have been able to get out. For days, the Russians struggled to get inside the submarine and kept turning down offers of foreign aid from Norway, from America, and from Great Britain. Then finally, 9 days after the Kursk had sunk, the Russians accepted foreign aid. That's when the Norwegian dive team went down. They were able to open up the escape hatch relatively quickly. When they went inside the submarine, they saw it was completely flooded. There were bodies floating everywhere. And that's when, ultimately, Dmitri's body was found. And they found that note tucked safely in his breast pocket. Russia would go on to award the entire crew of the Kursk with the Order of Courage, which is a very significant military award. The families of the crew were each given 10 years' salary. They were also given free housing in any Russian city of their choice, and their children would all have their college educations paid for. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. Sometimes the world presents us with a story so strange, so perfectly bizarre, that it feels like it must have a supernatural explanation. A voice from beyond the grave, a town-wide curse, a ghost reaching through a wall. These are the kinds of tales that make the hair on your arms stand up. But often, when you peel back the layers of the impossible, you don't find a ghost. You find something far more terrifying. A human being. Today we have 3 stories that all start in that strange, mysterious place, but end with a truth that is all too real and all too dark. Late on the night of the 26th of October 1968, a 72-year-old woman named Ethel Harris was resting in her living room in Toledo, Ohio. The house was quiet, and she was just enjoying the peace before heading to bed. Suddenly, the silence was broken by the sharp ring of the telephone. The first thing Ethel did was glance at the clock on the mantelpiece. The hands pointed to 10:30. That was unusual. Very few people, if any, ever called her this late at night. A knot of worry tightened in her stomach. A call at this hour usually meant bad news. She slowly got to her feet, walked over to the phone, and picked up the receiver. She said, "Hello?" On the other end of the line, a man's voice said back, "Hey sis." Ethel instantly recognized the voice. It wasn't one of her brothers, despite the familiar greeting. It was someone who was practically family, her husband Don's very best friend, a 59-year-old man named Lee Epps. For decades, Lee had been their next-door neighbor. He and Don and Ethel were inseparable. They were at each other's houses almost every single day, sharing meals, helping with chores, just living life together. They were the kind of friends who become an extension of your own family. A few years back, Lee had moved to a different town, so they didn't see each other quite as often, but the bond was still just as strong. They still got together whenever they could, and Lee made a point to call regularly just to check in and see how they were doing. So, hearing Lee's voice wasn't a surprise. But the time of the call was still a bit odd. Ethel figured he was just calling for a late-night chat. But before she could even reply to his greeting, before she could ask why he was calling so late, Lee just kept talking. It was strange. It was like he wasn't having a conversation with her, but was just delivering a message he had to get out. He spoke in a flat, hurried tone. He said, "Hey sis, I'm feeling really bad. Like I've never felt this way before. I really need your husband, Don, to get in touch with me the moment he gets back." And then, just like that, the line went dead. He had hung up. Ethel stood there, holding the silent receiver, completely bewildered. The whole call had lasted maybe 10 seconds. On one hand, it seemed like he was just checking in, but the words he used were serious, alarming. "I've never felt this way before. That's not something you say lightly." But there was something else. something that made a chill run down her spine. How did Lee know that Dawn wasn't home? Her husband was out for the evening and wasn't due back for a little while. Lee had stated it as a fact the moment he gets back. It was as if he was standing outside their window watching the house. But that was impossible. He lived in another town. It just didn't make any sense. Feeling a growing sense of unease, Ethel tried to call him back immediately. The phone just rang and rang. No answer? She tried again a few minutes later, and then again. Still nothing. By the time her husband, Don, finally walked through the front door a little while later, Ethel was pacing with worry. She immediately told him about the strange call from Lee. She recounted the conversation word for word. She told him, "He said he wasn't feeling good, that he needed you to call him as soon as you got back. But Don, the weirdest part was how he knew you were out." Dawn was just as confused as she was. He said, "All right, that's weird." He took the phone from Ethel and dialed Lee's number himself. Again, it just rang unanswered. Now, Dawn was getting seriously concerned. He turned to Ethel and said, "Go over it again." What was his tone like? Did he sound like he was in pain? Was he scared? What exactly did he say? Ethel tried her best to describe it. She said, "I don't know, he just sounded distant. He just stated that he didn't feel good and had never felt this way before. And he was very specific that you needed to call him when you came back. I just don't understand it." They both stood there in the quiet house, a shared feeling of dread hanging in the air. They knew Lee well enough to know he wasn't one for drama. If he said something was wrong, then something was wrong. After a few more failed attempts to reach him, they decided they couldn't just sit there and wait. They had to do something. They decided to just drive to his house in the next town and check on him in person just to make sure he was okay. So they locked up their house, got in their car, and started the drive into the dark night. When they finally arrived at Lee's house, all the lights were off. The place was dark and still. His car wasn't in the driveway. A quick look through the windows confirmed he wasn't there. Now, their worry was turning into real fear. Even though it was late, they started knocking on the doors of his neighbors, hoping someone had seen him or knew where he might be. After a few doors with no luck, one neighbor finally gave them a piece of information. The neighbor said they had seen an ambulance at Lee's house earlier in the evening and believed he had been taken to the hospital. For Ethel and Dawn, this was confirmation of their worst fears. Something was seriously wrong with their friend. They thanked the neighbor and rushed back to their car, heading straight for the nearest hospital, a place called Mercy Hospital. When they arrived, they hurried into the emergency room and spoke to the front desk. They explained that they were looking for their friend, Lee Epps. The nurse checked her records and confirmed that yes, Lee had been admitted earlier that night. But then her expression shifted, and her voice softened. She told them that, unfortunately, Lee had passed away. The news was a devastating blow. They had been friends for most of their lives. The thought of him being gone so suddenly and unexpectedly was almost impossible to process. But the most shocking part of their discovery was yet to come. As they spoke with the medical staff trying to understand what had happened to him, Don asked a simple question. He asked what time Lee had passed away. A doctor looked at the chart and then looked back at them. He told Ethel and Dawn that after some complications, Lee ultimately passed away at precisely 10:30 that night. The exact moment, the exact minute. His official time of death was the very same moment that the phone had rung in Ethel's living room. The same moment she had heard her friend's voice on the other end of the line, saying he had never felt this way before and that he needed to speak to his best friend one last time. Ethel and Dawn had no way to prove it, of course. It was just their word against the laws of physics. But for the rest of their lives, they firmly believed that the phone call they received that night wasn't from a telephone line. It was from somewhere else. It was Lee's spirit reaching across the veil to say goodbye. But a mysterious phone call is one thing. What was happening in a small village in rural China was something else entirely. It was a tragedy on a scale that was almost unimaginable. One afternoon in the summer of 2006, a 70-year-old man named Ma King Mao and several of his family members walked through the streets of their home, Luoan village. Luoan was, or at least it had been, a beautiful and historic place. As they walked, they passed lush green fields and could see majestic mountains rising in the distance. But the scenery was scarred. Interspersed with the beauty were the charred, skeletal remains of dozens of buildings. It was a constant, painful reminder of what their community had lost. Ma King Mao had lived in this village his entire life. He remembered a time when it was a happy, vibrant, tight-knit community of over 100 people. It was a truly picturesque place to live, a place where everyone knew each other and looked out for one another. But 3 years prior, everything had changed. Life in Luoan village had become a living nightmare, one disaster piling on top of another. It started with the fires. There hadn't been just one, but two enormous fires that had ripped through the village. The official cause was faulty wiring. These fires had destroyed homes, businesses, and priceless historic buildings. They had fundamentally changed the face of the town, and years later, the scars still hadn't healed. But as devastating as the fires were, it was what happened after the embers cooled that truly turned the village into a place of fear. For some unexplainable reason, the mortality rate in their small village suddenly skyrocketed. It seemed like every week someone else was just dropping dead. Healthy people, young people, it didn't matter. They would get sick suddenly and then pass away. The villagers became terrified. They started to believe that some kind of invisible plague had descended upon them, a curse they couldn't see or understand. The situation got so bad, with so many people dying, that China's Centers for Disease Control, the CDC, sent a team to conduct a full-blown investigation. They spent weeks in the village, testing, interviewing, and analyzing, but their conclusion was baffling. They announced that there was no connection between the deaths. They determined that everyone who had died had passed away from common illnesses or old age. They were all, according to the experts, natural deaths. It was just a tragic, statistical anomaly, an unfortunate spike in the mortality rate that just happened to follow the horrible fires. It was, they said, just a string of terrible coincidences. But many of the villagers, including Ma King Mao, simply didn't buy it. It felt wrong. It felt like something more was at play. They started to whisper that their village wasn't unlucky. It was cursed. And so, on this summer afternoon, Ma King Mao and his family walked past the burned-out shells of their old lives, making their way to the village temple. They were there for yet another funeral. This time, it was for a young woman from the village who had died just as inexplicably as all the others. According to the CDC, her death was from natural causes. But to the people who knew her, it made no sense at all. They filed into the temple, another cloud of grief hanging over their cursed home. Later that same night, Ma King Mao stumbled through the dark, quiet streets, heading back to his house. After the funeral, he and his family had gone to the deceased woman's family home for a ceremonial dinner, which was a local custom. His family had left right after the meal, but Ma King Mao, feeling particularly down about the state of his village, had stayed behind. He continued to eat and drink some alcohol, sharing stories and sorrows with his neighbors. Now, he was finally making his way home. But as he walked, a sudden, sharp pain shot through his stomach. It was so intense it nearly buckled his knees, making it incredibly difficult to walk. He clutched his abdomen, forcing himself to put one foot in front of the other, his house seeming miles away. When he finally reached his front door, he fumbled with the latch and stumbled inside. The pain was so blinding, so all-consuming, that he could only scream out for help before collapsing onto the floor right in front of his horrified family. As he lay on the ground, he began to vomit uncontrollably. And then, just moments later, he passed away. His family could do nothing but watch in horror. Now, Ma King Mao wasn't a village leader or a person of great influence. He was just a man who had lived there his whole life, a man everyone knew and respected. But for some reason, his death felt different. It felt monumental. For the people of Luan village, it was the absolute final straw. When they heard the news, a collective feeling washed over the community. Enough is enough. There was no possible way that all these deaths were natural. They refused to accept that answer any longer. The village director, who was essentially the town's mayor, got on the phone with the provincial health department. He explained the entire situation, the fires, the string of deaths, the CDC's inconclusive findings, and the village's refusal to believe them. The health department agreed to look into it and sent a team of 20 experts to the village. They conducted another massive investigation, trying to find any link, anything that could explain what was happening. And after all their work, they came back with the exact same conclusion as the CDC. It was all natural. There was nothing to worry about. But the villagers were not worrying. They were terrified and angry. They went back to their director and demanded that he do something else. This was not an acceptable answer. And he agreed. He made one last call, this time to the local police. He asked them to come in and conduct their own investigation, to look at this not as a health crisis, but as a potential crime. He begged them to see if there was anything, any small detail that the scientists might have missed. And so, the police came to Luoan village. They didn't bring microscopes or testing kits. They brought a different perspective. They started a broad, sweeping investigation, and very quickly they found something. Something the health experts had completely overlooked. And what they discovered explained everything. It turned out the village had one doctor, a man named Ma Fuxing. But Ma was not a real doctor. His medical training consisted of reading a couple of medical books. That was it. He had no formal education, no license, no real idea of what he was doing. And yet, he was the only person the villagers could turn to when they had any medical issues. He directly benefited every time someone got sick because they would come to him and pay for his useless treatments. So you had a man, posing as a doctor, who likely made his patients even sicker, and he was profiting from their illness. That was bad enough. But it got so much worse. Ma Fuxing was also the owner of the village's only funeral home. So, if his fake medicine didn't work and you died, he profited from you again. Ma Fuxing had a complete monopoly on sickness and death in Luoan village. If you got sick, he made money. If you died, he made money. The only way he didn't make money was if you stayed healthy. For a while, Ma Fuxing was content to just let this system play out. He was a fake doctor and a funeral director, and business was steady enough. But eventually, he got greedy. He wanted more money. So he started secretly poisoning the village's water supply with cyanide. Suddenly, more people started getting sick. And more people started dying. And for every single one of them, Ma Fuxing collected a fee. But even that wasn't enough. He wanted more. And so he looked around the village and decided to create even more death and suffering. Those two massive fires, the ones that were officially ruled as being caused by faulty wiring, that wasn't faulty wiring. That was arson. Ma Fuxing had set the fires himself, burning people's homes and businesses to the ground, killing people in the process, all because he knew he had a monopoly on the aftermath. Every death was just more business for him. The police investigation unraveled his entire scheme. They re-examined the fire scenes and quickly determined it was arson. From there, they started asking the one question the health experts never did: who benefits? All roads led back to Ma Fuxing. In the end, they determined he was responsible for the deaths of 76 people. These were his neighbors, people he had known his entire life. His friends. He had systematically murdered 76 of them for profit. He was ultimately arrested, convicted of murder and arson, and sentenced to death. The curse on Luoan village wasn't supernatural. It was a man. It's hard to imagine a more evil person. But sometimes evil isn't a stranger poisoning a town from the shadows. Sometimes it's sleeping in the room right next to yours. One morning in September of 1893, a 25-year-old man named Paul Marsh was sitting at a large dining room table inside his aunt's house in New Haven, Connecticut. He was there with his mother and his father for a family visit. They were staying with his aunt, a woman named Miss Blackwood, and also visiting with his 19-year-old cousin, a young woman named Malene. Malene was Miss Blackwood's ward. Her own parents had died 4 years earlier, leaving her an orphan, and the very wealthy Miss Blackwood had graciously taken her in. She had become Malene's de facto mother. On this particular morning, Paul, his parents, and Malene were all gathered for a luxurious breakfast that Miss Blackwood's housemaid had prepared. They were chatting and enjoying the food, but they were all waiting for one person to join them, Miss Blackwood herself. And this wasn't just a formality out of respect for their host. They genuinely adored her. Paul's aunt was a wonderful woman, full of energy and life. She was fun, she was witty, and yes, she was very wealthy, and her house was magnificent. Family visits with Miss Blackwood were always something to look forward to. Her arrival downstairs was what would truly start the day. But as time stretched on, and Miss Blackwood still hadn't appeared, the family began to eat. They figured she was just sleeping in or taking her time getting ready, and they would see her soon enough. So they ate their food and made pleasant conversation, enjoying the nice morning. Suddenly, their peaceful breakfast was shattered. The housemaid, who had gone upstairs a few minutes earlier, came running back into the dining room. Her face was pale with panic, and she was clearly distraught. She cried out that Miss Blackwood was dead. For a moment, Paul was just completely confused. It didn't make any sense. Just the night before, his aunt had been her usual vibrant self. She had seemed perfectly normal, perfectly healthy. There was absolutely no sign that anything was wrong with her. But the family immediately rushed out of the dining room and followed the frantic housemaid up the grand staircase to Miss Blackwood's bedroom. They pushed open the door, and there she was. Paul's aunt was lying in her bed, still and silent. She was cold to the touch. She was gone. Later that morning, Paul and his heartbroken family sat in the living room with Miss Blackwood's regular family doctor. He had just come from examining her body upstairs. He sat down with them and explained that while there were no clear signs of illness or injury, Miss Blackwood was 70 years old and had been diagnosed with heart disease a few years prior. In his professional opinion, her heart had simply given out in her sleep. It was a peaceful end. For the most part, the family reacted with a mixture of profound sadness and reluctant acceptance. It was tragic, but it made sense. Paul felt the same way, logically. It was awful, he couldn't believe she was gone, but the doctor's explanation seemed plausible. And yet, underneath the logic, there was a strange, nagging feeling that he couldn't shake. Something felt off. He couldn't put his finger on it, he couldn't articulate why, but he had an immediate gut-wrenching sense that this was not the whole story. He felt that something else had happened to his aunt. But Paul didn't say anything. He kept his suspicions to himself. It felt inappropriate to start suggesting conspiracy theories just hours after his aunt had died, especially when there was a perfectly logical explanation right in front of them. So, he stayed quiet, but the feeling didn't go away. It just sat there in the pit of his stomach. After the doctor left, Paul and his family decided that they would all stay at Miss Blackwood's house for the time being. There was so much to do. They had a funeral to plan, and they had to begin the complicated process of dealing with her will and her large estate. Since they had already planned to be there for a visit anyway, they decided to stay and help manage everything during this difficult transition. 5 weeks passed. Paul and his family were still living in Miss Blackwood's house. Sorting out her estate was proving to be a massive and complicated task, and it was taking much longer than anyone had anticipated. By this point, Paul's role in the legal and financial matters was minimal. He was mostly just there to provide emotional support for his parents as they navigated the complex paperwork. But secretly, Paul had taken on a mission of his own. He still hadn't told anyone about his persistent feeling that his aunt had been killed. He knew how crazy it sounded, especially since he had absolutely no evidence to support it other than that powerful gut feeling. but he hadn't been able to let it go. He had started his own quiet, secret investigation. His investigation had led him to a strange decision. He had started sleeping in his late aunt's bedroom. He had developed a belief that if he slept in her bed, in her room, then maybe her ghost would visit him. Maybe she would give him a sign, a clue, some kind of message that would tell him what really happened to her. For weeks, he had slept there every night, waiting. But he had seen nothing. No ghosts, no signs. Still, he wasn't ready to give up. On this particular night, 5 weeks to the day after his aunt's death, Paul was lying in her bed, getting ready to fall asleep. As he lay there in the darkness, he heard a strange sound coming from the side of the room. It was a faint, scraping noise, almost like scratching. The room was very dark, with only a little bit of moonlight filtering through the window. He opened his eyes and rolled over, peering into the shadows in the direction of the sound. At first, he couldn't see anything. But, as his eyes slowly adjusted to the dim light, he saw something that made his breath catch in his throat. It was a hand. A disembodied hand connected to an arm was reaching out from the wall, stretching into the room in his direction. Now, Paul had obviously never seen anything like this before. Logically, he should have been terrified. He was, for all intents and purposes, seeing a ghost. But he wasn't scared. A strange sense of calm and validation washed over him. He thought, this is it. It's working. My aunt is here. She's going to tell me what happened. This was the sign he had been waiting for. With absolutely no fear, Paul got out of the bed. He walked silently across the room towards the disembodied arm that was protruding from the wall. And then he reached out and grabbed it. The moment his hand closed around the arm, a blood-curdling scream echoed through the house. It wasn't a ghostly wail, it was the very real shriek of a terrified person. The sound woke everyone up. Paul's father came running down the hall and burst into the bedroom. The sight that greeted him was baffling. He saw his son, Paul, standing in the middle of the room, holding onto an arm that was sticking out of a hole in the wall. It turned out there really was an arm reaching through the wall, but it wasn't a ghost. It belonged to a person who had everything to do with Miss Blackwood's death, because she did not die of heart disease. She was murdered. The person sleeping in the room next door had drilled a hole through the wall, a hole just big enough for an arm to pass through. And late at night, while Miss Blackwood was asleep, that person had reached through the hole and poured poison into the glass of water she always kept by her bedside. She had died in her sleep from the poison, and it had been mistaken for a heart attack. The killer was aware that Paul was suspicious. Even though Paul had kept his thoughts to himself, his actions, especially his insistence on sleeping in Miss Blackwood's room, had made the killer very nervous. It seemed like Paul was getting close to the truth. And so, the killer decided to get rid of him the same way they had gotten rid of his aunt. They waited for Paul to be asleep, saw the glass of water next to his bed, and reached through the hole to pour poison into it. But they hadn't counted on Paul being awake, waiting for a ghost. He heard the sound, saw the arm, and grabbed it, thinking he was making contact with the spirit world. In reality, he was catching his own would-be killer in the act. The screams were the sound of the killer, realizing they had been caught. And the killer was Paul's own 19-year-old cousin, Malene. After her parents died, Miss Blackwood had taken Malene in and treated her like her own daughter. She had even added Malene to her will, ensuring the girl would inherit a significant portion of her vast fortune. But Malene couldn't wait for her aunt to die of natural causes. She wanted the money now. And so she had murdered the woman who had saved her. Caught red-handed, Malene quickly confessed everything to Paul and his parents. They sent for the police to come and arrest her for the murder of Miss Blackwood and the attempted murder of Paul. But before the police could arrive, Malene suddenly began bleeding from her mouth. She collapsed onto the floor and died just minutes later. While it was never officially confirmed, it's widely believed that she used the very same poison she had used on her aunt to take her own life, choosing to die rather than face justice for her crimes. Every story tonight started with something that seemed supernatural. But in the end, the real horror wasn't a curse or a ghost. It was human greed. Because sometimes the darkest thing in this world isn't what hides in the shadows. It's what people are willing to do for money, power, or just a little bit more. Until next time. Imagine driving down a dark, heavily forested highway on a cold winter night, surrounded by nothing but towering trees and the faint glow of your own headlights. That was the reality for dozens of commuters traveling on the A3 highway in Surrey, England, on the evening of December 11th, 2002. Surrey is known for being one of the most heavily wooded counties in all of Great Britain, and at night, the thick forests on either side of the asphalt can feel incredibly claustrophobic. Around 7:20 p.m. on this particular night, the peace of that drive was completely shattered. The local police department began receiving a flood of frantic emergency calls from drivers on the highway. The callers were all describing the exact same terrifying scene. They said there was a motorist driving with absolute madness on the road. This driver had their high beams on, completely blinding anyone in front of them, and they were weaving wildly in and out of the heavy traffic. The car was traveling at an incredibly high speed, tailgating people and nearly causing multiple pileups. And then, just a few minutes later, several of the callers reported something even more horrifying. They had actually watched this reckless car veer completely off the asphalt, hurtle down the steep, grassy embankment on the side of the highway, and plunge directly into the thick, dark tree line. To the callers, it looked like a catastrophic high-speed crash, and they were certain that whoever was inside that vehicle was either severely injured or dead. And so, the police department immediately dispatched a couple of officers to the scene to investigate. When the two officers arrived at the stretch of the A3 where the callers had reported the crash, they turned on their spotlight and began driving slowly along the shoulder. But the problem was, they couldn't see anything. There were no tire tracks in the grass, no broken branches on the trees, no debris on the ground, and no smoke rising from the forest. It was just a quiet, dark stretch of highway with normal traffic passing by. They drove up and down the road several times, shining their lights into the darkness, but there was absolutely no sign of an accident. At this point, if only one person had called, the officers would have assumed it was a mistake or a prank. But because so many different drivers had called in to report the exact same thing at the exact same time, the officers knew they couldn't just give up and go back to the station. They decided to park their patrol car on the shoulder, get out, and continue their search on foot. They turned on their high-powered flashlights and began walking along the edge of the dense forest, shining their lights directly into the thick brush. The woods were incredibly dense, and the winter darkness seemed to swallow the light from their torches. They walked for quite a while, their boots crunching on the frozen grass, searching for any indication that a vehicle had crashed into the trees. And then, after walking a significant distance, one of the officers stopped. His flashlight had caught a tiny glint of something reflective deep in the woods. It looked like a piece of plastic or metal, which was completely out of place among the dirt and tree trunks. The two officers stepped off the shoulder, slid down the steep embankment, and pushed their way into the thick, overgrown tree line. As they got closer, they realized they had indeed found a car. It was a heavily damaged hatchback, completely wedged between two large oak trees and covered in dirt, dead leaves, and branches. It was totally invisible from the road. The officers immediately called for backup and ran toward the vehicle, preparing themselves to find a badly injured driver. They looked through the shattered glass of the driver's side window, but to their surprise, the driver's seat was completely empty. They walked around to the other side of the vehicle and saw that the front passenger door was swung wide open. And there, lying on the ground just outside the open door, was a body. But when the officers shone their flashlights onto the body, they froze in complete disbelief. What they were looking at made absolutely no sense at all. To understand why these officers were so completely caught off guard, we have to go back 5 months in time, to the night of July 16th, 2002. On that warm summer night, a 21-year-old man named Christopher Brian Chandler was sitting in a pub in West London, finishing up a beer. This pub was located about an hour north of that stretch of the A3 highway in Surrey where the crashed car had just been found. Christopher was at the pub with a close friend, and it was supposed to be a fun night out. But as the hours passed, Christopher began to feel incredibly anxious. He couldn't sit still, and he kept staring nervously at the door. It turns out Christopher was actually a wanted man. The police in London were actively searching for him in connection with a robbery, and because of this, Christopher hated staying in one place for too long. He was terrified that the authorities would walk through the door at any second. He was being so secretive that the only people who even knew his whereabouts that night were the friend sitting across from him and his brother, whom Christopher had called earlier in the evening. Eventually, the paranoia became too much for Christopher to handle. He told his friend that he had to leave immediately. He said goodbye, walked out of the pub, got into his car, and began driving south. But Christopher never arrived at his destination. He simply disappeared, and nobody heard from him again. Christopher's brother eventually went to the police and reported him missing. But the problem was, the brother knew Christopher was wanted for robbery, so he assumed Christopher had just gone on the run to escape the law. The police felt the exact same way. They figured Christopher was actively trying to elude them, so they didn't put much effort into searching for him. The missing person report was filed away, and everybody just moved on. Fast forward to 5 months later, on December 11th, when those frantic drivers called the police about the reckless car crashing into the woods. When the two officers stood over the body they had found in the forest, they realized they were looking at Christopher's car. But when they looked down at the body lying next to the open passenger door, they saw that it was not a fresh casualty of a recent crash. It was almost entirely a skeleton. The flesh had completely decayed, the clothes were weathered, and it was obvious that this person had been dead for months. The forensic investigators who arrived at the scene would later confirm that the skeletal remains did indeed belong to Christopher Brian Chandler. They estimated that he had died on the very night he disappeared 5 months earlier on July 16th. This meant that Christopher had crashed his car and died in those woods in the middle of summer. But this realization created a mind-bending paradox. If Christopher had been dead in those woods for 5 months, who was driving the car that dozens of motorists saw tearing down the A3 that very night? Who was the reckless driver who veered off the road and crashed into the embankment at 7:20 p.m. on December 11th? The Surrey police tried to explain this by saying it was all just one massive, unbelievable coincidence. Their official theory was that there actually was a reckless driver on the highway that night, but that driver had somehow managed to recover from their near crash, pull back onto the road, and drive away undetected. And then, by sheer luck, when the police went searching that specific area of the woods, they just happened to stumble upon Christopher's 5-month-old crash site. But the problem was, several of the callers had been very specific. They didn't just see a car drive erratically, they watched it go over the embankment and crash into the trees in real time. And when the police searched that exact spot, they found Christopher's car, which had all the hallmarks of a fresh, violent impact, yet the driver had been dead for half a year. To this day, there is no logical explanation for how those drivers witnessed a crash happening in real time that had actually occurred 5 months in the past. It remains one of England's most famous and haunting mysteries, known to the public as the A3 ghost crash. Now, our next story takes us to northern France, to a quiet, picturesque little village where life moved at a very slow and peaceful pace. On the morning of August 2nd, 2017, 2 men were sitting together inside a local bar, laughing, drinking, and talking. These 2 men were Lucien Perrault and Olivier Boudin. Even though there was a massive age difference between them, with Lucien being 69 years old and Olivier being 38, the two were absolutely inseparable. The locals in the village actually referred to them as father and son because they were always together, looking out for one another. Lucian had spent his entire life working hard in a manufacturing plant in a nearby city, but just 4 years earlier, he had finally retired and moved into a small house in this quiet village. But when he first moved in, he was incredibly lonely and depressed. Lucian was divorced, he struggled heavily with alcohol, and he felt like he had nothing left to look forward to in life. But then he met Olivier, and everything changed. When they first met, Olivier was also going through a very difficult time. He was dealing with some chronic health issues that made it hard for him to maintain steady work, and he was constantly bouncing between the nearby city and the village, trying to find his footing. When these two men connected, they instantly bonded over their shared struggles. For Lucian, what really mattered was that Olivier, despite being so much younger, never treated him like a useless old man. He treated Lucian like a true peer and a best friend. Before long, their lives became completely intertwined. They created a daily routine of meeting up, walking through the village, and helping each other out, which gave both of them a brand new sense of purpose and joy. On this particular morning, as they sat in the local bar, they began talking about what they wanted to do that night. They decided they would have a nice summer barbecue at Lucian's house. Lucian would grill up some beautiful beef ribs, and they would sit out on his back garden patio, drink some wine, and spend the evening enjoying the warm summer air. It sounded like a wonderful, simple plan. In fact, the bartender would later recall overhearing their conversation and remembering just how incredibly excited both men seemed about their upcoming cookout. And so, that evening, Olivier and Lucian arrived at Lucian's house and headed out to the backyard patio. Lucian had gone to the trouble of setting up a lovely scene. He had placed a small round table on the patio and covered it with a classic red and white checkered tablecloth. On the table, he set out an open bottle of wine, some fresh cheese, and a baguette. Olivier sat down at the table, pouring them some wine and enjoying the food, while Lucian walked over to the grill to start cooking up the beef ribs. Now, Lucian had a neighbor who lived very close by, whom we will call Marie. Marie's second-floor bedroom window directly overlooked Lucian's backyard patio. That night, as the sun began to set, Marie happened to glance out her window and saw the two men. They were playing music, laughing, and goofing around, having a great time. Marie was very used to seeing them spend time together, and she knew they often stayed up late, drinking and talking. She didn't want to be a nosy neighbor, so she simply closed her window to block out the noise, went to bed, and fell asleep to the distant sound of their music and laughter. The next morning, around 6 a.m., Marie woke up and looked out her window once again. She glanced down into Lucian's yard, and what she saw didn't surprise her at all. Lucian was still sitting perfectly upright at the round table, looking as though he might be eating or drinking. Olivier, however, was lying flat on his back on the ground next to the table, completely passed out. Marie chuckled to herself, thinking that the two men had clearly stayed up all night drinking, and Olivier had simply fallen asleep on the grass. She didn't want to judge them, so she decided to mind her own business and went about her morning. A few hours later, around 9 a.m., Marie left her house to go to another neighbor's property to feed their chickens while they were away for the day. As she walked past Lucian's yard, she glanced through the fence and saw that the scene had not changed at all. Lucian was still sitting at the table in the exact same position, and Olivier was still lying motionless on the grass. Marie started to feel a small twinge of concern, but she figured they were just sleeping off an incredibly heavy hangover, so she kept going, fed the chickens, and spent the morning doing her chores. But when Marie returned to her house around noon, she looked into the yard again, and this time she was genuinely alarmed. The sun was now high in the sky, and the summer heat was becoming intense. Yet, Lucian and Olivier had still not moved a single fraction of an inch. Lucian was still slumped at the table, and Olivier was still spread out on the grass. Marie realized that even if they were severely intoxicated, the blistering heat of the midday sun would have forced them to wake up by now. They were going to get severe heat stroke if they stayed out there any longer. And then Marie walked up to the edge of the yard and began shouting their names, trying to get them to wake up. But she got absolutely no response. Realizing that something was terribly wrong, Marie panicked. She ran to a nearby neighbor's house, told them what was happening, and together they grabbed several large pots of cold water. They ran back into Lucian's yard and threw the water over both men, hoping the sudden shock would wake them up from their drunken stupor. But when the cold water hit them, neither man flinched. They didn't move at all. Marie reached out and touched Lucian's arm, and she immediately realized they were cold. They were both dead. The next day, the local prosecutor made a public announcement stating that they were launching a full criminal investigation into the two men's deaths, which were being treated as highly suspicious. The prosecutor explained that it appeared Lucian and Olivier had died at the exact same time, leading investigators to believe this was either a double homicide or a tragic murder-suicide. The primary theory was that someone had put a deadly poison in their food or wine. The police began searching the patio for evidence. They found a can of beans that the men had been eating, along with the remains of the beef, the bread, and the wine. They immediately shipped the canned beans to a highly specialized medical institute in Paris to test for botulism, which is a rare and extremely lethal toxin that can grow inside improperly sealed canned goods. But a few days later, the results came back completely negative. There was no botulism. The police then sent the rest of the food and the wine to several other forensic laboratories to be tested for a wide range of chemical poisons, heavy metals, and toxic substances. But once again, every single test came back completely clear. There was absolutely nothing toxic in anything they had consumed. The investigators were completely baffled. There were no signs of a struggle, no physical injuries on either body, and no trace of poison. How could two best friends suddenly drop dead at the exact same moment in the middle of a peaceful backyard barbecue? But then the official autopsies were completed, and the forensic pathologists discovered a series of events so incredibly tragic and bizarre that no one could have ever predicted them. It turned out that Lucian and Olivier were not murdered, nor was it a suicide. They had died due to an almost impossible combination of minor, non-fatal medical issues that collided in the worst possible way at the exact same moment. The autopsies revealed that Lucian had very poor dental health and was missing a large number of his teeth. Olivier, on the other hand, suffered from a condition called cardiomegaly, which meant his heart was slightly enlarged and fragile. While this condition was being monitored by doctors and was fully under control, it made his heart highly sensitive to sudden, extreme stress. On the night of August 2nd, these minor medical issues became a recipe for disaster. Lucian had grilled up a plate of tough beef ribs. Because he was missing so many teeth, he had a very hard time chewing the meat, but he was enjoying the food and the company so much that he was wolfing it down very quickly. At some point during the meal, Lucian swallowed a massive, unchewed chunk of the tough beef rib. The meat got securely lodged in his throat, completely blocking his airway. Lucian began to desperately choke, turning blue and gasping for air. Sitting right across from him, Olivier watched his best friend and father figure suddenly start dying in front of him. Olivier was immediately seized with an overwhelming wave of panic and terror. He jumped up from his chair, his adrenaline spiking as he prepared to run to his friend's aid. But the sheer shock, terror, and physical exertion of that sudden, high-stress moment was too much for Olivier's fragile, enlarged heart. The intense stress caused his heart to instantly seize up. He suffered a massive fatal heart attack and collapsed dead onto the grass. Meanwhile, Lucian was still choking. With Olivier now lying dead on the ground, Lucian had absolutely no one left to perform the Heimlich maneuver or help him clear his airway. He remained slumped over the table, desperately struggling to breathe, until he finally suffocated and died right there in his chair. The next morning, when Marie looked out her window, she wasn't looking at two hungover friends sleeping off a wild night of drinking. She was looking at the silent, tragic scene of an unbelievable double tragedy. The two inseparable friends who had brought so much joy and meaning back into each other's lives had been taken away in a matter of minutes by a cruel, freak sequence of events. Our third story takes us to the vast, beautiful, and incredibly treacherous waters off the northeastern coast of Australia. It was a little after 7 a.m. on the morning of April 15th, 2007, when three close friends launched a beautiful 35-foot white catamaran called the Kaz 2 from a local marina. They were setting off on what they all believed would be the ultimate adventure of their lives. The captain of the Kaz 2 was 56-year-old Des Batten. Des was a highly experienced, deeply responsible sailor who had spent months meticulously planning every single aspect of this journey. The two friends he was bringing along with him were Jim Tunstead, who was 63 years old, and Jim's older brother, Peter Tunstead, who was 69. These three men were not reckless risk-takers. They were stable, devoted family men who had all been happily married to their wives for over 30 years. Des had 2 children, Jim had 4, and Peter had 5. They were all either fully retired or right on the verge of retirement, and this voyage was meant to be a grand celebration of their hard work and the beginning of a peaceful new chapter in their lives. Their planned route was incredibly ambitious. They were going to sail the Kaz 2 from the northeastern side of Australia, travel all the way up and around the northern coast of the continent, and then head down the western coast to their final destination of Perth, where they all lived. The entire trip was scheduled to take about 8 weeks. The men were absolutely giddy with excitement at the prospect of spending 2 full months out on the open water, fishing, drinking cold beers, and enjoying each other's company. They had spent a lot of time and money preparing the boat to ensure it was completely safe and seaworthy. Shortly after they launched the boat on April 15th, Peter's wife called his cell phone to see how the departure had gone. When Peter answered, she could immediately hear the immense joy in his voice. In the background, she could hear Des and Jim laughing and joking around, clearly having the time of their lives. Peter told his wife that the weather was absolutely gorgeous, the water was as calm as glass, and they were about to set up their fishing rods and crack open some beers. It sounded like the absolute perfect start to their dream trip. Peter told his wife that he loved her, promised to keep her updated, and then they hung up the phone. Now, because Des was a highly experienced sailor and a member of a volunteer marine rescue group, he was absolutely obsessed with safety. He knew how quickly the ocean could turn deadly. Before they even set foot on the boat for the trip, Des made Jim and Peter go through multiple rigorous man-overboard drills on the Kaz 2. He wanted to make absolutely certain that if anyone fell into the water, the remaining crew members would know exactly how to operate the life-saving equipment and pull them back on board safely. They practiced these drills until they were completely second nature. Furthermore, when they charted their course, Des established a very strict rule. They would always sail close to the shoreline. They would never venture out into the deep, unpredictable open ocean because staying close to the coast meant they would always be within reach of help if an emergency arose. To document their journey, Jim had brought along a video camera, and around 10 a.m. on that first morning, he turned it on and began filming. In the video, which would later be recovered, the men look completely happy and relaxed. Des is at the helm, smiling warmly, while Peter sits nearby. In the background of the video, the Australian coastline is clearly visible, proving that they were strictly adhering to Des's safety rule of staying close to the shore. But just a few hours after Jim stopped recording that video, things began to take an incredibly strange turn. A woman named Isabel Wheeler, who did not know the three men and had never seen the Kaz 2 before, was fishing from the shore in an area called Champagne Bay. As she looked out over the water, she spotted a beautiful white 35-foot catamaran sailing from east to west along the horizon. She watched it for a little while, but then she saw the boat make a sudden, sharp 90-degree turn. Instead of continuing along the safe, planned route near the coast, the catamaran began sailing directly out towards the deep, open ocean, away from the safety of the land. Isabel didn't think much of it at the time, as she had no idea about the men's strict safety rules, so she just went back to fishing. But the problem was, the very next day, April 16th, two other independent witnesses, who also didn't know the crew, were looking out over the water near Champagne Bay. Quite incredibly, they both spotted the Kaz 2 sailing from east to west in the exact same spot where Isabel had seen it the day before. Now, this made absolutely no sense. The Kaz 2 was on a strict point-to-point journey to Perth. There was absolutely no reason for them to double back and spend 24 hours sailing in circles in the exact same bay. But the witnesses were certain of what they saw. And then, on the following day, April 17th, a group of local fishermen were working in the waters farther north of Champagne Bay. They saw the Kaz 2 navigating its way incredibly close to the shore, but the fishermen were deeply concerned because the area the catamaran was sailing through was a notorious, highly dangerous coral reef system. One wrong move could easily rip the bottom of the boat open. Furthermore, the fishermen noticed that the boat's massive sails were completely torn to shreds, flapping wildly in the wind. However, as they watched the boat, they saw a Mei standing at the helm, calmly steering the vessel through the dangerous reefs. The pilot looked so completely in control of the boat that the fishermen assumed he knew exactly what he was doing, so they decided not to intervene or report it. Then came April 18th. A Coast Watch surveillance helicopter was flying its routine patrol over the Great Barrier Reef when the crew looked down and spotted the Kaz 2. The helicopter crew immediately noticed that the catamaran's sails were badly damaged and the boat was navigating through some very treacherous, shallow waters. The helicopter crew tried to contact the Kaz 2 over the marine radio, calling them multiple times to ask if they needed assistance. But there was only silence on the radio. No one answered. The helicopter crew watched the boat through binoculars. They could see a figure at the helm steering the boat expertly between the coral reefs. Because the pilot seemed to have the situation under control, and because they didn't see any obvious signs of distress, the helicopter crew decided not to initiate a full-scale rescue. However, they did feel that the situation was strange enough to warrant a check, so they contacted the Marine Police and gave them the boat's coordinates, suggesting they send a patrol boat out to make contact. But when the Marine Police finally reached the designated area, the Kaz 2 was gone. The police immediately began looking into the boat's registration and contacted the families of Des, Jim, and Peter. The families were frantic. They told the police that except for the brief phone call Peter had made to his wife on the morning of April 15th, not a single one of them had heard from the men. They had gone completely silent. They hadn't answered any phone calls, and they hadn't checked in as planned. At this point, the authorities realized they were dealing with a major emergency. A massive air and sea search was launched, utilizing multiple planes, helicopters, and boats to scan the vast ocean. 2 days later, on April 20th, a search helicopter spotted the Kaz 2 floating about 80 miles off the northeastern coast of Australia. The boat's tattered sails were flapping in the wind, and it was drifting listlessly, spinning slowly in circles. From the air, the rescue crew could see that the deck of the catamaran was completely empty. The searchers had no idea what they were dealing with. It was entirely possible that the boat had been boarded by pirates or smugglers, and that Des, Jim, and Peter were being held hostage down below. Or perhaps the men had been killed, and the perpetrators were still hiding inside the cabin, waiting to ambush anyone who approached. Despite the immense danger, a brave rescue officer named Corey Benson volunteered to board the vessel. Corey was lowered from the helicopter into the ocean. He swam through the choppy water, reached the side of the drifting catamaran, and climbed up the ladder onto the deck. The moment his boots hit the wood, he was struck by how eerily quiet it was. There was no sound except for the wind and the tattered sails flapping. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood, and no damage to the boat's hull. Corey began to slowly search the deck. As he walked, he started finding clues that indicated the crew had been active just minutes before. He found a fishing rod cast out into the water, securely locked into its holder on the side of the boat, as if someone had been waiting for a bite. On a small outdoor table, there was a blue mug filled with coffee, sitting there undisturbed. On a deck chair, a t-shirt was neatly folded with a pair of reading glasses resting on top of it. Everything looked completely normal, as if the men had just stepped away for a brief moment. Corey walked to the helm and found that the boat's GPS was fully functional and the engine was actually still running, idling quietly. Corey reached over and turned the key, shutting the engine down. Now Corey had to face the most terrifying part of his mission, searching the cabin below. He knew that if there were hostile hijackers on board, they would be waiting for him down there. He drew a deep breath, walked down the short flight of stairs, and opened the door to the cabin. He stepped into a small, neat, common area that served as a kitchen and living space. On the table, he saw a newspaper dated April 15th, the day the men had set sail. On the wall, a calendar had days crossed off up until April 14th, but April 15th was untouched. On another table, a laptop computer was open, plugged in, and fully powered on, showing a screen that looked like someone had just been using it. Nearby, there were plates of food set out, looking relatively fresh, as if a meal had just been prepared and was about to be eaten. Corey looked into the sleeping quarters and saw that the beds had been slept in, and the men's personal belongings, including their wallets, cash, identification, and life jackets, were all sitting exactly where they should be. But Des, Jim, and Peter were nowhere to be found. They had completely vanished from the face of the earth, leaving behind a perfectly functional boat with a running engine, food on the table, and all of their safety gear untouched. A massive investigation was launched to try and piece together what had happened on the Kaz-2. But the deeper the investigators dug, the more confusing the mystery became. Why had the boat been seen turning out toward the open ocean, directly violating the captain's strict safety rules? Why had it been seen doubling back and sailing in circles in Champagne Bay for 24 hours? Who was the mysterious figure that multiple witnesses and the helicopter crew saw standing at the helm, calmly steering the boat through dangerous coral reefs with tattered sails? The official coroner's inquest would eventually propose a theory. They suggested that on the afternoon of April 15th, one of the men had gone to the edge of the boat to try and free a tangled fishing line or retrieve a dropped item. He had lost his balance and fallen into the ocean. The second man, seeing his friend in the water, had rushed to help him, but had also fallen overboard. The third man, panic-stricken, would have tried to steer the boat back to save them, but in his haste, he too fell into the water, leaving the catamaran to drift away on its own, while the three men tragically drowned in the ocean. But this theory had massive holes. If the men had all fallen overboard on the very first day, April 15th, then who was the pilot that multiple independent witnesses and a professional helicopter crew saw steering the boat on April 16th, 17th, and 18th? Why were the sails ripped to shreds if the boat had just been drifting? And why was the engine still running and the coffee still fresh when Corey Benson boarded the boat on April 20th? To this day, the families of Des, Jim, and Peter have never received any real answers. The three men, and whatever truly happened to them out on the water, remain lost to the sea, leaving behind one of the most baffling maritime mysteries in modern history. We have to look closely at how the initial investigations into these cases unfolded, because the details are where the truth always hides. In the case of the Athry ghost crash, the Surrey police were faced with an absolute impossibility. When they first processed the scene, they found that the registration of the car matched a 1994 Vauxhall Astra. This was a car that had been registered to Christopher Brian Chandler, who had been missing since July. The area where the car was found was a steep decline about 20 yards off the main road, completely enveloped by dense underbrush, nettles, and mature trees. It was a location that was completely invisible to any passing vehicle, even during the bright daylight hours. And so, when the police department first received those calls on December 11th, they were expecting to find a fresh accident scene. The callers had been incredibly descriptive. One caller, a truck driver who had been traveling south on the A3, told the dispatchers that he had seen a dark hatchback lose control, slide sideways down the embankment, and disappear into the trees with its headlights still shining brightly. Another caller, a woman driving a sedan, reported that she had to swerve to avoid the same erratic vehicle just seconds before it left the road. She described the sound of the tires screeching and the violent impact as the car hit the tree line. But the problem was, when the officers actually reached the vehicle on foot, they found a scene that had been undisturbed for months. The car's battery was completely dead, and the engine block was cold and rusted. The tires were deflated, and thick vines had grown up through the wheel wells, wrapping themselves around the axles. Silt and dead leaves had accumulated on the hood and roof, forming a layer of organic debris that had clearly taken months to build up. The interior of the car was damp and covered in mold. There was absolutely no way that this vehicle had been driven on the highway that night, let alone crashed just minutes before the police arrived. At this point, the investigators were forced to look at the skeletal remains on the ground. The body was lying outside the open passenger door, partially covered by leaves and dirt that had naturally fallen over the preceding months. The forensic pathologist who examined the remains noted that there were no signs of trauma inflicted by another person. The bones showed fractures that were completely consistent with a high-speed vehicle impact, including broken ribs and a fractured collarbone. The decay of the soft tissue was extensive, indicating that the body had been exposed to the elements, insects, and small animals for approximately 5 months. This timeline matched perfectly with the date of Christopher's disappearance on July 16th. It turns out the police's initial theory that Christopher had gone on the run to escape his robbery charge was technically correct in terms of his motivation, but tragically wrong in terms of his fate. Christopher had indeed been trying to flee the area, but his escape was cut short on that very first night. He had been driving down the A3 in the middle of the night, likely speeding and paranoid that he was being followed, when he lost control of his vehicle and crashed into the dense woods. The impact had likely thrown him toward the passenger side, or he had managed to crawl out of the open door in a desperate attempt to find help before collapsing and dying in the dark forest. Because the woods were so dense, his car and his body remained hidden just yards from one of the busiest highways in England, completely unnoticed by the thousands of drivers who passed by every single day. But the problem was, this did not explain the calls on December 11th. The Surrey police maintained that the reports of a reckless driver and a crash that night were simply a bizarre coincidence. They argued that a different, unidentified vehicle must have been driving erratically on the highway, veered off the road, and then somehow recovered and drove away, leaving no tracks behind. But the callers had been very specific about the exact location of the crash. They had pointed the police directly to the spot where Christopher's car had been sitting for 5 months. It was almost as if a spectral reenactment of the crash had occurred, a phantom event that forced the authorities to finally look into the woods and find the young man who had been missing for half a year, allowing his family to finally have some closure. When we look at the tragedy in northern France, we see a similarly baffling sequence of events that initially pointed toward a terrible crime. On the afternoon of August 3rd, 2017, the small village was completely cordoned off by the local gendarmerie. The news that Lucien Perrault and Olivier Boudin had been found dead on the patio had sent shockwaves through the community. Because they were so well liked and had no known enemies, the villagers could not comprehend what had happened. The initial investigation focused heavily on the physical evidence found on the red and white checkered tablecloth. The police found the open bottle of red wine, which was half empty, 2 glasses, a partially eaten baguette, a plate of local cheese, and the remains of the grilled beef ribs. There was also a can of white beans that had been opened and partially consumed. Because there were no visible signs of violence on either Lucien or Olivier, the detectives immediately suspected that the men had been poisoned. And so, the police collected all the foodstuffs from the table and sent them under tight security to the forensic laboratories in Paris. The primary suspect was botulism, a highly potent neurotoxin produced by the bacterium Clostridium botulinum, which can thrive in improperly preserved or expired canned goods. If a person consumes food contaminated with botulism, the toxin quickly attacks their nervous system, causing paralysis, respiratory failure, and death within a very short period of time. Because the men had been eating canned beans, this seemed like the most logical explanation for their simultaneous deaths. But the problem was, the laboratory analysis came back completely negative for botulism. The scientists also tested the wine, the cheese, the baguette, and the beef for other common poisons, such as arsenic, cyanide, strychnine, and modern pesticides. Again, every single test was negative. The food was perfectly safe to eat, and the wine was completely untainted. There was no chemical explanation for why these 2 men had died. At this point, the investigators were forced to wait for the results of the autopsies, which were performed at the Forensic Institute in Amiens. When the medical examiner completed his examination, the pieces of this bizarre puzzle finally started to fall into place, revealing a sequence of physical events that was almost too tragic to believe. The autopsy of 69-year-old Lucien Perrault revealed that his lungs were completely clear of any fluid or disease, but his trachea was entirely blocked. A large piece of tough grilled beef rib, measuring nearly 3 inches in length, was wedged tightly in his throat. Lucien had tried to swallow this massive piece of meat without chewing it. The pathologist noted that Lucien was missing almost all of his molars, which are the teeth responsible for grinding down tough food like meat. Because he lacked these teeth, and because he was eating quickly, he had swallowed the chunk of beef whole. It had immediately blocked his airway, preventing him from breathing or making any sound. He was experiencing acute asphyxiation, a terrifying state where the brain is rapidly starved of oxygen. Next, the medical examiner performed the autopsy on 38-year-old Olivier Boudin. Unlike Lucien, Olivier's airway was completely clear, and there was no food in his trachea. However, his heart showed signs of a massive acute myocardial infarction. Olivier had a congenital heart condition known as cardiomegaly, which is a pathological enlargement of the heart muscle. While people with this condition can live relatively normal lives with proper medication and monitoring, their hearts are extremely vulnerable to sudden, massive spikes in blood pressure and adrenaline, and so the reconstruction of their final moments became painfully clear. Lucien and Olivier were sitting at the table, enjoying their dinner and the music playing from the radio. Lucien took a large bite of the beef rib, failed to chew it properly due to his missing teeth, and attempted to swallow it. The meat became lodged in his throat, and he began to choke violently, clutching his chest and throat, his face turning blue as he struggled for air. Olivier, sitting directly across from him, saw his best friend and father figure suddenly suffocating and thrashing in his chair. Olivier was instantly seized with an overwhelming wave of panic and terror. The sudden shock of seeing his friend dying caused a massive instantaneous release of adrenaline into Olivier's bloodstream. His heart rate skyrocketed and his blood pressure surged. For a normal, healthy heart, this would have been a standard fight-or-flight response. But for Olivier's enlarged and fragile heart, it was a lethal blow. The cardiac muscle simply could not handle the sudden, violent surge of pressure. His heart went into ventricular fibrillation and seized up completely. Olivier suffered a massive heart attack, collapsed backward onto the grass, and died within seconds. Lucien, who was still desperately struggling to dislodge the meat from his throat, was now left completely alone. He had watched his younger friend suddenly collapse onto the ground, unable to help him. Lucien had no way to perform the Heimlich maneuver on himself, and without anyone there to assist him or call for help, he simply sat in his chair, losing consciousness as his brain was starved of oxygen until he finally passed away. Fast forward to the next morning, when their neighbor Marie looked out her second-floor window. She saw Lucien sitting at the table and Olivier lying on the grass, and she assumed they had just had a long night of heavy drinking and were sleeping it off. It was only hours later, when the hot midday sun failed to wake them, that she realized the horrifying truth. The two best friends, who had found such comfort and companionship in each other's company, had been taken away in a matter of minutes by a cruel physical chain reaction of events. Now, when we look at the mystery of the CAS-2, the details of the investigation are even more baffling. The 35-foot catamaran was designed and built to be one of the safest, most stable vessels on the water. Catamarans have twin hulls, which makes them incredibly resistant to tipping over, even in rough seas. The vessel was equipped with state-of-the-art navigation systems, life jackets, an emergency position indicating radio beacon, and a fully functional marine radio. When the rescue officer, Corey Benson, boarded the boat on April 20th, he was stepping onto a vessel that was fully operational. The boat's GPS was still active, and when investigators analyzed the recorded data, they were able to reconstruct the exact path the CAS-2 had taken since its departure from Airlie Beach on April 15th. The GPS data showed that the boat had traveled along the planned coastal route for the first few hours of the trip, just as Jim's video had shown. But then, around 2 p.m. on April 15th, the GPS recorded a sudden, sharp 90-degree turn to the northeast. The boat began sailing directly away from the coast, out into the deep, open waters of the Coral Sea. This turn was made at a speed of about 6 knots, and the boat maintained this heading for several miles. But the problem was, there was absolutely no reason for the crew to make this turn. Des Batten was a highly experienced sailor who was deeply familiar with the dangers of the open ocean, and he had been adamant about staying close to the shore. Furthermore, the GPS showed that after sailing out into the open water for several hours, the boat made another series of turns, eventually doubling back and returning to the vicinity of Champagne Bay on April 16th. This matched perfectly with the testimonies of the witnesses. Isabel Wheeler had seen the boat make that sharp turn on April 15th, and the two other witnesses had seen it sailing in circles in the exact same area on April 16th. But why would 3 experienced sailors spend 24 hours sailing in circles, violating their own safety rules, without ever radioing for help or using their satellite phone? And then there was the sighting by the fishermen on April 17th. They saw the boat navigating through a highly dangerous coral reef system. The sails were torn to shreds, indicating that the boat had been battered by strong winds or had been improperly handled. Yet, the fishermen were certain that they saw a man standing at the helm, calmly steering the boat through the reefs. The pilot looked completely in control, steering the vessel around the shallow obstacles with expert precision. This was confirmed again on April 18th by the crew of the Coast Watch helicopter. They also saw the boat with its damaged sails, and they also saw a figure at the helm steering the boat through the treacherous waters. They tried to make contact over the radio, but they received no response. At this point, the investigators were faced with a massive contradiction. If the 3 men had fallen overboard and drowned on the very first day of the trip, as the official coroner's inquest would later suggest, then who was the person steering the boat on April 16th, 17th, and 18th? Who was the pilot who navigated the vessel through miles of dangerous shallow coral reefs with tattered sails without ever responding to radio calls or setting off the emergency beacon? When Corey Benson boarded the boat on April 20th, he found that the engine was still running, idling quietly in neutral. The GPS was on, and there was a cold but half-filled mug of coffee sitting on the table. A t-shirt was neatly folded on a chair with a pair of reading glasses resting on top of it. In the cabin, there were plates of food set out on the counter, and a laptop computer was open and running. All of the men's wallets, cash, passports, and life jackets were sitting in their lockers, completely untouched. The official coroner's theory was that one of the men had gone to the transom of the boat to try and free a tangled fishing line or retrieve a dropped item. He had lost his balance and fallen into the water. The second man, seeing his friend in the water, had rushed to help him, but had also fallen overboard. The third man, panic-stricken, would have tried to steer the boat back to save them, but in his haste, he too fell into the water, leaving the catamaran to drift away on its own, while the three men tragically drowned in the ocean. But this theory simply could not explain the physical evidence. If the men had all fallen overboard on April 15th, then who was the person seen steering the boat for the next 3 days? How did the boat navigate through miles of dangerous coral reefs without crashing if there was no one on board? And why was the engine still running and the coffee still sitting on the table 5 days later? If the boat had been drifting unmanned for 5 days, the engine would have run out of fuel, and the coffee would have evaporated or been knocked over by the movement of the waves. The families of Des, Jim, and Peter were left with a haunting, unresolved mystery. They had watched their loved ones set off on a dream vacation, completely happy and healthy, only for their boat to be found completely empty just a few days later, with all of their belongings untouched. Despite an extensive search and a detailed investigation, no trace of the three men was ever found, and their disappearance remains one of the most baffling maritime mysteries in modern history. Each of these three cases leaves us with a profound sense of unease. They remind us that the world is full of strange, unpredictable forces, and that sometimes the line between the living and the dead, the past and the present, is far more fragile than we would ever like to admit. Whether it is a ghost car reenacting a tragic crash from 5 months in the past, a freak physical chain reaction that takes the lives of two best friends in a matter of minutes, or a perfectly functional catamaran floating empty in the vast ocean with its engine still running, these stories show us that the truth is often far stranger than any fiction we could ever write. When we think about Christopher Brian Chandler, we are left with the image of a young man who spent his final months hiding from the world, only for his resting place to be revealed by a mysterious event that defies physical explanation. His family was able to finally lay him to rest, but the question of who was driving that car on December 11th will never be answered. For Lucien Perrault and Olivier Boudin, their lives were defined by a deep, unlikely friendship that brought warmth and meaning to their final years. Their sudden, simultaneous deaths were not the result of a violent crime or a malicious act, but rather a tragic physical coincidence that joined them in death just as they had been joined in life. And for the families of Des Batten, Jim Tunstead, and Peter Tunstead, the ocean remains a vast, silent vault that holds the secret of their loved ones' final moments. The Caz 2 continues to drift in the memories of those who knew them, a beautiful white catamaran sailing forever into the unknown, leaving behind only tattered sails and unanswered questions. The investigations have long since closed, the official reports have been filed away in dusty archives, and the locations where these events took place have returned to their quiet, normal routines. The A3 highway is still crowded with daily commuters driving past the trees where Christopher's car once sat. The small village in northern France still enjoys its quiet summer evenings, though the patio next to Marie's window remains empty. And the beautiful blue waters off the coast of Australia still draw sailors and fishermen from all over the world who look out over the horizon and wonder what truly happened to the crew of the Caz 2. These cases remind us of the fragility of our everyday lives. We plan our journeys, we gather with our friends, we set sail on our adventures, completely unaware of the invisible threads of fate that are constantly moving around us. And when those threads collide, they can create mysteries that will haunt us for generations, leaving us to search the dark woods, the silent backyards, and the vast open seas for answers that may never come. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. On October 9th, 2010, a little 2-year-old boy named Rowan Griffin was sitting happily in the back seat of his family's car. He was buckled into his car seat, wedged between his 2 older siblings. His father was at the wheel, navigating the familiar country roads. They were all on their way to a big family party, a get-together at Rowan's grandparents' house. It was one of those perfect autumn days, the kind that feels like a special occasion all by itself. The grandparents lived in a town called Richmond, New Hampshire. It's a very rural part of the state, a place where houses are separated by thick stands of trees and long winding driveways. Their home was exactly like that. It was literally nestled in the woods. To even get to the house, you had to turn off the main road and go down a very long gravel driveway that cut through the forest. The house itself was a simple single-story home, but the real attraction was the backyard. Rowan's grandparents had spent years clearing out the trees behind the house, creating this huge open space. It was the perfect spot for family cookouts, for kids to run around, and for everyone to gather. As Rowan's dad turned the car into that long driveway, they could already see that the party was in full swing. Cars were parked all along the gravel path, lining it all the way from the house back out to the street. It was a clear sign that this was going to be a big one. They found a spot to park and made their way up towards the house. And sure enough, when they rounded the corner into the backyard, it was just a sea of people. There were adults chatting in groups, teenagers tossing a football, and dozens of little kids, Rowan's cousins, running and screaming with joy. For a 2-year-old like Rowan, it was paradise. The moment his dad unbuckled him, he and his siblings took off like a shot, disappearing into the crowd of kids to go play. For the next couple of hours, everything was perfect. The kids were having the time of their lives, darting between the adults, playing tag, and exploring the edges of the big yard. The grown-ups were catching up, grilling food, and just enjoying the beautiful day. At some point, a few of the adults started to notice Rowan. Later, when they would try to piece everything together, they'd all remember the same detail. They saw Rowan chasing a cat. The grandparents had a friendly little cat that lived on the property, and Rowan was absolutely fascinated by it. He was following it all around the backyard, his little legs pumping as he tried to keep up. A number of adults saw him do this. They saw him giggle as the cat dodged around a picnic table. They saw him chase it towards the edge of the woods that bordered the yard. And a few of them even saw him run right into the woods, following that cat as it disappeared into the trees. But here's the thing about a big party like that. There's a sort of mob mentality that can set in. Every single adult who saw Rowan run towards the woods thought the exact same thing. They thought, someone else is watching him. His dad is here. His mom is here. There are so many aunts and uncles and grandparents around. Surely someone has an eye on him. They weren't trying to be negligent or careless. It was just a simple and dangerous assumption. In a crowd that large, everyone assumes someone else is responsible. They figured, what could possibly go wrong? He's just a few feet away chasing a cat. He'll be back in a second. A little while later, Rowan's father, Mr. Griffin, was looking around for his youngest son. He scanned the yard, expecting to see his little boy playing with the other kids, but he couldn't spot him. He didn't panic at first. In a yard full of people, it was easy to lose sight of a small child for a moment. He walked over to the group of older kids and asked them casually, "Hey, have you seen Rowan?" And they all said something similar. Oh yeah, I think I saw him chasing the cat. I think he was over there by the trees. So, mister. Griffin walked over to where they were pointing. He looked around, but still no Rowan. He started asking some of the other adults. Have you seen my son, Rowan? And he got the same answer, over and over. Yeah, he was chasing the cat. I think he ran over in that direction. After a few more minutes of this, after looking around the entire yard and getting the same vague story from everyone, a cold feeling started to creep into Mr. Griffin's stomach. Everyone had seen him, but no one had seen him for the last 10 or 15 minutes. No one knew exactly where he was right now. He raised his voice and called out to the whole group. Hey, everybody, can you just stop for a second? I can't find Rowan. Everyone's telling me he was chasing a cat, but I can't find him anywhere. Can anyone tell me where he went? The cheerful party atmosphere evaporated in an instant. The music was turned down. The conversation stopped. Suddenly, everyone was looking around, their faces filled with concern. A quick, frantic search began. They checked inside the house, looking under beds and in closets. They checked the garage. They looked in the front yard, at the end of the long driveway. They even started checking inside all the parked cars, just in case he had somehow wandered in and fallen asleep. But he wasn't anywhere. He wasn't in the house, he wasn't in the yard, he wasn't in any of the cars. He was just gone. The group of family and friends started fanning out, yelling his name. Rowan! Rowan! Their voices echoed through the trees that surrounded the property. They ran into the woods, the same woods that several people had seen him run into just a short time before. They pushed through the underbrush, looking behind every tree and under every bush. But there was no sign of him. Mr. Griffin looked at his watch, his heart pounding in his chest. He tried to think back. How long had it been since he had last seen his son with his own two eyes? He couldn't be sure. 10 minutes? 20? An hour? He had no idea how long Rowan had been gone for. He wasn't taking any more chances. He pulled out his phone and he called 911. The police arrived quickly. They understood the urgency of the situation. A 2-year-old lost in the woods with nightfall approaching. It was a worst-case scenario. They immediately launched a massive search operation. Officers on foot started creating organized search lines, sweeping through the forest methodically, but this was rural New Hampshire. The community was tight-knit. As words spread about the missing boy, locals started showing up to help. People who lived in the area and owned ATVs and four-wheelers brought them out. They started driving the trails and old logging roads that crisscrossed the vast forest, their headlights cutting through the growing darkness. Soon, there were hundreds of people out there, police officers, family members, friends, and complete strangers, all united by one goal, to find Rowan. They were all yelling his name, their voices overlapping in a desperate chorus that filled the woods. But as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, dark shadows through the trees, they still hadn't found him. They hadn't found a single clue. No footprint, no piece of clothing, no sign at all of where he might have gone. The running theory was that he had simply gotten lost in the forest. After all, the last confirmed sighting of him was chasing that cat into the trees. It made sense. But they had searched the immediate area so thoroughly, it was hard to believe they hadn't found him if he was close by. They just didn't know. Finally, the sun went down completely. The woods became pitch black, and the temperature started to drop. The search commanders made the difficult but necessary decision to postpone the search. It was too dangerous to have hundreds of people wandering around in the dark in such rugged terrain. They would resume at first light the next morning. You can only imagine how horrible that night was for Rowan's parents. They were sitting inside the grandparents' house. the same house that had been filled with so much joy just hours earlier. Now it was silent and tense, filled with an unbearable sense of dread. They were forced to just sit and wait, wondering what was happening to their 2-year-old son who was all alone somewhere out in the cold, dark woods. Very early the next morning, long before the sun had even fully risen, a huge crowd of volunteers gathered again at the grandparents' house. They were determined to find Rowan. The search commanders broke them up into groups, assigning each group a specific area of the forest to search. There was one particular group of volunteers that had an idea. They wanted to look a little bit farther away than where most of the search efforts had been focused the day before. The main search was concentrated on the area immediately surrounding the house. This group wanted to go about 3 miles away to a large, swampy area they knew was out there. It seemed like a long shot. It was hard to imagine a 2-year-old could have traveled that far on his own, but they felt they had to check everywhere. So, this small group of searchers set off. They made their way through the dense woods for a couple of hours until they finally reached the edge of the swamp. And they could tell right away that this was going to be incredibly difficult terrain to search. It was a true swamp, wet and deep and treacherous. They were all wearing waders to keep dry, but with every step they took onto what looked like a solid patch of ground, they would sink 2 or 3 feet into the cold, murky water. It was slow, exhausting work, just sludging their way through the thick bog. They pressed on, moving deeper into the swamp. At some point, they made their way through a thick patch of reeds and into a small clearing. And that's when they saw it. Sitting on top of a fallen log on a small patch of dry land, there was what looked like a pair of children's shoes. They looked small, definitely small enough to belong to a child. Their hearts started to beat a little faster. They waded their way over to the log and climbed up onto the dry section of land. They walked over and picked up the shoes. They were definitely kids' shoes. This had to be a sign. They immediately started yelling out for him. "Rowan! Can you hear us, Rowan?" They yelled a few times and then they stopped, holding their breath and listening intently. For a moment, there was only silence. The sound of the wind in the reeds, the buzzing of insects. And then they heard it. A tiny, faint voice calling back to them. From somewhere deeper in the swamp, they heard him yell, "Here!" They followed the sound of his voice, pushing their way past a huge, thick bush. And when they looked through the branches, they saw something they could not believe. In the middle of a wide, open bog of water, there was a tiny little island, and on that island, there was a single tree. And clutching onto that tree was Rowan. He was just standing there on this little patch of land, holding on to the tree trunk. From where they were standing, he looked perfectly fine. He looked dry. He looked okay. He was just standing on this island in the middle of a deep swamp, completely surrounded by water. Immediately, the searchers didn't hesitate. They jumped right back into the water and started wading their way out towards the island where Rowan was. The whole time they were moving towards him, the water was coming up to their chests. They were looking around, trying to gauge the depth. It was at least this deep all the way around the little island. It was a significant body of water. And as they got closer, they looked up at Rowan and they confirmed what they had seen from a distance. The little boy was bone dry. His clothes weren't wet. His hair wasn't wet. He was a 2-year-old. They had no idea if he knew how to swim or not, but it seemed highly unlikely. And so, as they were sludging through this chest-deep water, they were all thinking the exact same thing. How in the world did he get out here? But in that moment, none of that mattered. Their only thought was, let's just get this kid and bring him back to his parents. They finally reached the edge of the island and pulled themselves up onto the dry land. They gave Rowan a quick look over. He seemed completely unharmed, just a little scared. One of the searchers gently picked him up, making sure to keep him out of the water, and they carried him all the way back. They navigated their way out of the treacherous swamp, back through the woods, and all the way back to his parents. Initially, when they brought Rowan back, everyone was just so overcome with happiness and relief that he was alive. His parents, the police, the hundreds of volunteers, they were all just celebrating the fact that he was safe. No one was asking any tough questions. No one was pressing the issue of what happened, or how he was found on that island, or how he got out there in the first place. They were just leaving it alone. They were just so incredibly happy to have him back. But after the initial wave of emotion had passed, after the dust had settled, Rowan's parents started to gently ask him some questions. They would sit with him and say, what happened out there? How did you get lost? And how did you get onto that little island? At first, Rowan wouldn't say anything. He was only 2, and he had clearly been through a major ordeal. But eventually, he did start to talk about it a little bit. He said that there were cows out there, in the woods. He said that he was very scared of the cows. And he said that he went to the island because he wanted to get away from the cows. Now, this was a very strange thing for him to say. The police and the searchers knew for a fact that there were no cows in that swamp. There were no farms for miles around. There was no livestock anywhere near where he was found that night. So, this left 2 possibilities. Either he was so scared and disoriented that he was hallucinating, seeing animals that weren't there at all, or he was seeing something else, something real, and his 2-year-old brain was simply mislabeling it as cows. Whatever it was that he saw, or believed he saw, it had clearly scared the heck out of him. Whenever his parents would bring up the cows, he would get very frightened and agitated. But, regardless of what he saw or didn't see, the million-dollar question remained. How did he get out to that island? It was a physical impossibility. For a 2-year-old boy, as small as he was, to get to that island, he would have had to swim. The water was simply too deep for him to walk through. It was chest deep on a full-grown man. And everyone knew that Rowan did not know how to swim. But even if you entertained the idea that he had somehow magically found a way to swim across that deep water, there was still a huge unexplainable problem. Why wasn't he wet? The searchers who found him were adamant. He was bone dry. It's also worth noting that this entire strange event took place just a few miles away from a place known as the infamous Bennington Triangle. This is an area in southern Vermont, right near the New Hampshire border, where there has been a whole string of very strange and mysterious disappearances over the years, many of which have never been solved. Back in 1953, there was an 11-year-old boy named Jerry Monkman. Jerry was, by all accounts, considered a very frail child for his age. He was much skinnier than the other boys in his class, and he was shorter than most of his peers. On top of that, he had a really bad case of asthma. This was a breathing condition that made doing anything remotely physical very difficult and sometimes even dangerous for him. But despite his perceived fragility and his health issues, Jerry absolutely loved being outside. He loved hiking, he loved camping, and he was a very proud member of the Boy Scouts. So, on April 25th of that year, Jerry was incredibly excited. He found out that his Boy Scout troop was offering a special trip. They were going to the Rocky Mountain foothills to go camping and hiking for an entire weekend. For a boy who loved the outdoors as much as Jerry did, this was a dream come true, and he jumped at the opportunity to go. A few days later, Jerry, his entire troop, and their troop leaders all piled into a van, and they made their way up into the majestic Rocky Mountains. As soon as they got there and set up their camp, they headed out on a wickedly rugged hike up into a place called the Teton Canyon. They had been hiking for about an hour, making their way up the steep trail, when one of the troop leaders, who was at the back of the line, happened to turn around to do a head count. And that's when he realized Jerry was gone. The leaders had no idea how long he had been missing for. Had he just wandered off the trail a minute ago? Or had he been gone for 20 minutes? They didn't know. They quickly searched the immediate area for a couple of minutes, calling his name, but there was no response. Realizing the seriousness of the situation, one of the leaders didn't hesitate. He ran back down the mountain as fast as he could to try to get help. Soon, the sheriff's department arrived on the scene. And as news of the missing Boy Scouts spread through the nearby towns, an incredible thing happened. 1,600 volunteers from the local community poured out onto the mountain. They came from all over, ordinary people who just wanted to help find this little boy. They formed massive search lines and began combing across the mountain, determined to find Jerry as quickly as possible. But after several hours of intensive searching, they couldn't find a single trace of him. As the day wore on, people started to think the worst. And then, just as hope was starting to fade, there was a breakthrough. The search party had brought out a bloodhound, a dog specially trained to track human scent. The handler gave the dog an article of Jerry's clothing to get a scent, and the dog immediately picked it up. It started barking and straining at its leash, and then it took off, pulling the handler up the trail. The handler of the dog was ecstatic. He yelled out to everyone, "Hey, he's picked him up! We're gonna find him. We're gonna find him." He thought the dog was going to lead them to Jerry within a mile or so of where they were. He figured the boy had probably just wandered off the path and was sitting under a tree somewhere nearby. But the dog didn't lead them to a nearby spot. The dog just stayed on a complete beeline, heading straight north, deeper and deeper into the wilderness. It didn't waver, it didn't circle back. It just kept going with incredible determination for 6 straight hours. It tracked straight north, hour after hour, until it finally came to a stop at the edge of a big, dark swamp. The dog looked up at its handler as if to say, "I found it." This is where the trail ends. This swamp was 12 miles away from where Jerry had gone missing. The handler and the small group of searchers who had managed to keep up with the dog were completely baffled. They looked at the swamp, and then they looked back in the direction they had come from. They thought about Jerry, this frail 11-year-old boy with severe asthma. It seemed totally, utterly improbable that he could have maneuvered 12 miles uphill through some of the most rugged and difficult terrain in the area, all the way to this remote swamp. It just didn't seem physically possible. But they still felt like they had to search it. The dog had led them here, after all. So they spent the next hour carefully searching the entire swamp. But there was nothing there. No sign of Jerry at all. The dog handler was convinced his dog must have made a mistake. Maybe it had picked up the wrong scent, or maybe the trail had gone cold. So he tried to give the scent to the dog again, thinking that this time the dog would turn around and start heading back towards the area where Jerry had originally gone missing. But instead, his dog did something strange. It just sniffed the air, looked around, and then sat down right where it was, essentially reconfirming that, nope, this is where the scent brought me. I'm still right. The dog was certain this was the end of the trail. The dog handler and the exhausted searchers who had made this long, treacherous 12-mile journey up to the swamp, they just couldn't accept it. They decided that the dog must have made a mistake. The kid could never have been here. It was a physical impossibility. So they turned around and began the long walk back, feeling defeated. The next morning, at around 8 o'clock, a completely different story was unfolding about 30 miles away from where Jerry had gone missing. An 8-year-old boy named David was out riding his horse. He was just enjoying a quiet morning ride when he happened to look over at the tree line that bordered the field he was in. And just then, a boy stumbled out of the trees. The boy looked tired and disoriented, but he waved to David. So David rode his horse over to see who it was. And it turned out it was Jerry Monkman. Jerry just told David that he needed to get back to his group. David, being a curious 8-year-old, asked him, what are you doing all the way out here? And Jerry's answer was simple and strange. He just said, I don't really know. I need to get back to my group. I was with a group yesterday and I need to get back to them. Apparently, David then asked him the logical follow-up question. Well, how did you get here if you were with them yesterday? And all Jerry could say was, I fell asleep under a tree. I don't know. When word got back to the massive search party that they had found Jerry and that they had found him 30 miles away, they were in a state of absolute disbelief. The day before, it had been considered completely unbelievable that he could have possibly traveled 12 miles to that swamp. The searchers had literally dismissed the bloodhound's findings because they thought it was so impossible. No way, they said. He couldn't have done it. And now they were being told that he had clearly traveled at least 30 miles to have been found by David where he was. And that's 30 miles as the crow flies. That's a straight line on a map. The reality is, when you're walking through the wilderness, you don't walk in straight lines. You have to make turns, you go left and right to get around obstacles, you follow switchbacks up and down hills, and the area he must have traveled through over those 30 miles is all unmarked wilderness. It's this rugged, hilly, awful, unmarked terrain. So, for him to cover 30 miles in a straight line, he almost for sure had to have covered 40, maybe even 50 plus miles on foot to get there. So, the police asked him. They sat down with him and they said, Jerry, how did you do this? How did you cover the incredible distance you covered in such a short amount of time? And Jerry would just tell them the same thing he told David. He said he just remembers sleeping under a tree. And then he would wake up and he would see animals. He said they were poking their heads around from behind different trees. He didn't know what kind of animals they were, but they were watching him. And he was worried that they were going to hurt him, but they never did. He said he was able to just keep walking, and he would keep sleeping under these trees, and he kept seeing these strange animals that were just watching him from a distance. And he just kept repeating, they never hurt me. They never hurt me. Obviously, this did not answer any of the questions that the investigators were desperate to have answered. They just felt like, okay, maybe he's in shock. We can try to ask him again at another time. But as time went on, his story never changed. And so the prevailing theory among some became, well, then he must have been abducted. That's the only way he could have covered this kind of distance. But that just begs an even bigger question. Who is capable of moving an 11-year-old boy that much distance through that kind of terrain in such a short amount of time? We're talking about a 30-hour window, moving potentially 50 plus miles, lugging an 11-year-old around through the Rocky Mountains. And even if there was someone or something that was capable of lifting up an 11-year-old and maneuvering them that much distance in such a short amount of time, the question is, to what end? Why would they do that? Why was Jerry then maneuvered all the way to that swamp where the bloodhound lost his trail and then maneuvered even farther to the spot where he was eventually found? It doesn't make any sense at all. One of the most remote and isolated places in the entire world is an island called Bull Deer Island in Alaska. It's located about 2/3 of the way to Russia along the Aleutian chain of islands. The nearest inhabited island is about 50 miles away across a stretch of brutally cold and dangerous ocean. The weather on Boulder Island is pretty brutal, especially during the long, dark winters. And back in the 1940s, there was no electricity there, no running water, nothing. In 1944, during the height of World War II, the United States Army decided they wanted to send a small team of 5 of their soldiers to monitor the weather station on Bull Deer Island. That was basically the one and only thing the island was used for. One of the people that was selected for this very unique assignment was a guy by the name of Bud Houston. Bud was originally from Wisconsin. He had worked in a shipyard before enlisting in the Army in 1942. He was a big hunter and a skilled outdoorsman, and so the prospect of living on this kind of desolate, wild Alaskan island really appealed to him. He was actually excited about the assignment, In October of that year, Bud was flown out to Buldir Island, and he met with the other 4 soldiers who were going to be living on the island with him for the foreseeable future. It was going to be just those 5 men on the entire island. There was no one else there. They quickly learned that their primary job, monitoring the weather station, was a very low-effort task. They could get all of their required duties done over the course of the day pretty easily, and this freed up a lot of time for them to explore the island. And that would actually become their favorite pastime, because there really wasn't much else to do there except explore the island. So very quickly, the 5 of them became extremely familiar with the whole place. It wasn't that big of an island after all. It was maybe 2.5 miles wide by 4.5 miles long. On March 3rd, 1945, about 5 months after they had first arrived on Buldir Island, the men were complete experts on their tiny remote home. By now, they knew every square inch of the island. They were very comfortable there. On that particular day, they had to do a routine patrol around the weather station. This was something they did multiple times a week, so it was very routine, nothing out of the ordinary. All 5 of them were sitting inside the weather station, and Bud said that he would do it. So Bud grabbed his rifle, and he headed outside to do this simple patrol. The other 4 soldiers just stayed inside the weather station, probably playing cards or reading. After about an hour had passed, they realized that Bud hadn't come back yet. This was a little strange. The patrol he was supposed to do does not take more than 20 minutes, max. So they stepped outside to see if he was out there. The weather at the time was very mild for an Alaskan island. There was no snow on the ground, it wasn't very cold, and it wasn't very windy. The visibility that night was actually pretty good. So they're looking out over the island, and it's important to remember that Buldir Island has no trees. At the very far end of the island, on the opposite side from where the weather station was located, there is one significant-sized mountain. But short of that, it's not a particularly mountainous island. It's mostly rolling, grassy tundra. So, from their perspective at the weather station, they could look out over the island and basically see everything. And they didn't see him anywhere. At first, they were not that worried about it. They figured, you know what? It's Bud. He knows what he's doing. He's been here for so long, he's probably just out exploring or something. But they decided they should probably go look for him just in case. They went down to the water, to the shoreline, but he wasn't down there. They walked all around the far side of the island calling his name, but they couldn't find him. By the time they got back to the weather station, a real sense of worry had set in. They decided they had to tell their command that they had lost him. So they got on the radio and they called back to their higher command. They said, "We don't know where he went. He went out on a routine patrol, we didn't hear anything, and now he's gone." A whole bunch of reinforcements were sent out to the island to help with the search. They came out on boats and were dropped off to look on foot with the other 4 soldiers. There were also planes and helicopters brought in to do aerial searches. For 2 full days, they looked all over that tiny island for Bud. They scoured every inch of it, and they couldn't find him. And you have to remember, there are very few places you could possibly even go on that island where they wouldn't be able to look and see you. It's small and it's wide open. So, after 2 days of finding absolutely nothing, everyone started to think the same thing. He must have jumped into the water, or maybe he slipped and fell into the water. It was the only logical conclusion. There was simply nowhere for him to hide on the island itself. And so, after a couple of days, the commanders were so sure that it was just not possible for him to still be on the island that they called the search off. They officially declared that he must have fallen into the water and been swept out to sea. Fast forward 40 years to 1988. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was conducting a study on the bird populations on Buldir Island. And while they were there, they made an absolutely amazing discovery. This crew of researchers had set up their base camp at about 1,600 feet of elevation, high up on the one large mountain that was on the far side of the island. They were basically on the complete opposite end of the island from where the old weather station had been. One of the crew members happened to be walking around one of the large boulders near their camp, and as he walked past it, he looked down. And he saw this little tiny crevice between the boulder and the ground. He thought he saw something glinting inside of it. So he got down on his hands and knees, and he peered into the dark opening, and he realized, to his shock, that there was a human skeleton that had been kind of crammed into this tiny, tight space. The skeleton still had the tattered remains of a military uniform on it. The uniform had been kind of balled up, but it was definitely a uniform on what was left of the skeleton. And there was also a rifle that had been jammed down in there as well. It would later be identified, and it would turn out to be the remains of Bud Houston. So, this discovery raised a whole host of new, impossible questions. First of all, why did Bud say he was going to go outside and do a simple patrol, which really just meant walking around the immediate vicinity of the weather station? You're certainly not traveling very far. Why did he say he was going to do that? And then proceed to walk 4.5 miles to the other end of the island and then climb up 1,600 feet to the top of this mountain? It makes no sense. But even if he had some secret unknown reason to be over there, a much bigger question is, why would he then force himself into this little tiny crevice? If he was looking for shelter from the elements, well, the weather that night was incredibly mild. It would not have been life-threatening to be out in the elements, at least not that first night or even the second night of the search. And besides, he knew the island like the back of his hand. He probably could have found a much better place for shelter than this awful little crevice. But if he was at a point where he was seeking shelter under these boulders, instead of just walking back to the weather station and getting real warm shelter, then he had to have been in some kind of emergency situation. That's the only way that makes any sense. But if he was in an emergency situation, he would know that his responsibility as a soldier is not just to survive, it's also to be found again. You need to make sure you're not obscured underneath a boulder so that no one can find you. This island, it was like the easiest place in the world to be found. There are no trees. There were helicopters and planes flying directly overhead. And there were all these people on foot searching for him in a very small space. All he had to do was not be hidden under a boulder. Maybe during the day, when the weather let up, he could have rolled out from under the boulder and let himself be found. But that's not what happened. What probably happened is that Bud somehow got crammed into that little tiny crevice almost immediately after he left the weather station to do that patrol. But logically speaking, he would not do that to himself. It doesn't make sense from a survival perspective. So, if he didn't do it to himself, then someone else had to have done it. But all the other people on the island, the only 4 other human beings for 50 miles, were all inside the weather station together at the time this would have been happening. They had a solid alibi. So it really makes you wonder, what happened when he walked outside of that weather station? Who or what did he see? And what did they do to him? Unfortunately, after all these years, we'll probably never know the answer. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.